Be here now.
The average American family looks at now 5 hours of television a day. They spend 31% of their spare time looking at television. It emerges America in large-time fantasy, designed to entertain, not to inform. It's a serious addiction. It's a sedative, though not really a satisfaction. One feels angry with oneself for watching so much, miserable when one can't. It's a twilight sleep in which they dream professionally produced dreams. Early conditioning of Brave New World bizarre. 75% of children between 5 and 8 watch television. They draw themselves close, smiling, with blankets and pillows and dolls and pets, comforting up to the television. They watch 20,000 commercials a year and don't even understand the concept of commercial. How else would you get a population to value the act of acquisition itself? How far have we come? What did Aldous predict in 1931? That was the year I was born. That was the time of the American dream. That was the time in which we thought we had, through our democratic system, that tension between community and individuality beat. The freedom of the individual and a stable social system. But physical science and technology ran away with us. We got enamored of progress. We got enamored of what our minds could create. We got attached to the siddhi, the power of our intellect, untempered by wisdom. We didn't anticipate in the creation of the automobile the smog over Los Angeles. Nothing was bad about progress. Only the bomb finally woke us up. And even now, the result is that we are dealing with a strangulation of our system by nuclear waste, which we don't know what to do with. That is a killing agent to anything it contaminates, and that has a half-life of 250,000 years. And we don't know where to put it, where we're safe. Because there was no wisdom in the way in which we let technology run. We only saw the good because we were conditioned. Progress is good, progress is good, progress is good. As surely as if we had been sleep conditioned. By the 30s and the 40s, all this obviously had changed. I'll give you one more quick example of the conditioning in Brave New World. The babies are brought into a room. There are roses and there are beautifully illustrated books in the middle of the room. The children all rush towards, crawling towards the rose and the book. And as they approach, just as they start to touch them, huge loud noises and cacophony occurs. And the children scream, and then just to put this, make sure the message gets home, an electric shock passes through their bodies. So they are negatively conditioned to hate books and roses. When asked why, well, obviously books would get you thinking, You want to hate to read. But why flowers? Well, at first we wanted everybody to use the transportation system to go out into the country, so we had a positive conditioning for flowers. But then we saw that when they went out in the country, they didn't consume. They just looked at flowers. So we changed it so that they would love going to the country to use the transportation, but they would hate nature, by getting them to love sports that could only be done in the country and that required large amounts of sport apparatus. Do you see all those cars with skis on top? Did it work? There we are. By the time he was writing in the 30s and 40s and 50s, Aldous was still seeing the dark shadow embracing the culture. But he was beginning to whisper in his writings of another alternative. As he got deeper into the deeper qualities of mind, he began to imagine the healthy marriage of intellect and non-conceptual awareness. He began to see that a reasonable plan, people reasoning together, using the intellect in a reasonable way, along with a connection to the mystery behind form, might allow people to create a social system in which, though the members of the society would grow up through processes that they would experience and through inviting them to grow and nurture, as Ashley Montague was talking, in a surrounding of love, they could grow into beings that would both be free as individuals and would choose voluntarily to enter into community and would feel the space within it, and where the community would not have the physical sciences and its progeny outweigh the social, psychological sciences and the spiritual dimension. And he was then an out-and-out mystic. And in the perennial philosophy, in his Brave New World Revisited, he's still pointing the dark picture, but in his preface to the 1945 edition of Brave New World, he is suggesting this very subtle possibility, but he is implying how vulnerable it is. And anybody that wants to question how vulnerable a reasonable, spiritually connected society, how vulnerable it is in the middle of the mainstream, need only look in the newspapers about Tibet in the presence of China. We are seeing it lived out right at this moment. How a society dedicated to peace, with all of its failings, not want to romanticize it, with all of its failings, committed to peace and nonviolence, is being swallowed up by the machine of industrial, free market economy, military, industrial, blah. And everyone's afraid to scream. Most everyone. But I've asked myself about Tibet. Do I think that the lamas, the high lamas whom I have had the grace to know, have siddhis or powers? The answer is yes, I think they have them. The second question I ask myself is, do I think the high lamas are clearer and wiser than the Chinese leaders? And I have to answer, yes, I think that. Otherwise, why am I studying with Tibetans and not with Chinese leaders? I'm not talking about the Chinese people now. I'm talking about the political system of China. And then I say, well, if the Tibetans are more powerful and wiser, how could the Chinese take over Tibet unless the Tibetans wanted them to? I mean, who's in control here anyway? That plunked me right up against the mystery. And I thought, could it be that the Tibetans use the Chinese to force them, the Tibetans, to go out as refugees into the world, to take the Dharma out into the world at a time when it was needed, and to proliferate in a non-threatening way into all social systems? See, you take the scenario, you rewrite a few lines. See how it looks? It's all in the viewing. It's all in the vector view. I don't say that's the scenario, I just say it's worth keeping in mind to balance it. And so in Island, when Pala, which is Aldous's image of if you and I all got together with good spirit and goodwill and reasonableness and our inner work and tried to figure out how to take all the ideas we've had these few days and manifest them and create a social system for that. Why at the end does he come to the ending that Jean tries to convince him not to come to? And to me, it is not that it doesn't happen. It's just that the ending of that system is part of its happening. I think we often look at too narrow a scope of the story to be able to appreciate the richness of it. And maybe this is a moment when I can digress for one moment to tell you a story that is probably it's funny that I'm going to do this because I hadn't even thought of doing it in all the months I've been preparing for this lecture. But when I saw the pain and heard the pain in one of the questioners last night that said, when it's so dark and overwhelming, what can we do? I remembered a story, or it came to me now, a story that I'd like to share with you. When I came back from India, I was in a very high state. Tej light was pouring out of my head, and I was out of time, and I was living in a cabin and cooking my khidri in a pot and washing out of a pail, and I was holding on to my high as I could. I had my beard and my beads and my dress. And at one point, I was going out to teach, right at the early part. I was going out to teach, I think, at Esalen. And I had acquired a 1938 Buick limousine. This was now 1968, 69, or 70, I guess. And so I started out in this limousine, and I had opened the trunk so I could, inside, so I could sleep in the back part of the limousine. So I made it into a camper. It was this 6,000-pound automobile that drove like a tank, and I was driving it across the country. So I started out on the New York Thruway, and I was just galumphing along, and I was in such a high state that I was hanging out with various forms of the divine. And I was doing my mantra, which I usually am doing one way or another, repeating the names to remember that this isn't the only game in town. So that I'm holding onto the steering wheel and I'm keeping enough consciousness to keep the car on the road. But at another part, I'm singing to Krishna, who's the one I picked at that moment. Krishna is blue, is radiant, plays the flute, is the seducer of the beloved, all of whom we are, back into the merging with God, back into the formless. And I am in ecstasy hanging out with Krishna, blue Krishna, driving along the New York freeway, when I notice in my rearview mirror a blue flashing light. Now, there's enough of me down, since I'm learning how to integrate these things. You drive when you're doing religious practices? How irresponsible. But I kept enough ground, so I knew it was a state trooper. So I pulled over the car, and this man got out of the car, and he came up to the window, and I opened the window, and he said, "May I see your license and registration?" Now, I was in such a state that when I looked at him, I saw that it was Krishna who had come to give me darshan. Because how would Krishna come in 1970? Why not as a state trooper? Christ came as a carpenter. I don't understand why it couldn't be a state trooper. And so Krishna comes up and he says, "May I see your license?" He can have anything. He can have my life. All he wants is my license and registration. So I give him my license and registration. It's like throwing flowers at the feet of God. And I am looking at him with absolute love. So he goes back to the car and he calls home. And then he comes back and he walks around the car and he says, "What's in that box on the seat?" I said, "They're mints. Would you like one?" They were mints. He said, "Well, the problem is you were driving too slow on the freeway. And you'll have to drive off the freeway if you're going to drive this slowly." I said, "Yes, absolutely." And I'm just looking at him with such love. Now, if you put yourself in the role of a state trooper, how often do you suppose they are looked at with unconditional love? Especially when they're in their uniform. So after he had finished all the deliberations, he didn't want to leave. But he had run out of state trooperness. So he stood there for a minute, and then he said, "Great car you've got here." See? That allowed me to get out, and we could kick and spit and hit the fenders and say, "They don't make them now like they used to," and tell old car stories and talk about straight eights and slant sixes. And then we ran out of that. And I could feel he still didn't want to leave. I mean, why would you want to leave if you're being unconditionally loved? Where are you going to go? You already got what you wanted. What are you going to do? That takes care of your power needs, all of it, as Ashley pointed out last night. So finally he runs out. He knows he's either got to come clean that he's Krishna. See? So he says, "Be gone with you," which isn't a state trooper talk, but what the hell? I mean, he can have a little sloppiness in his lines. It's all right. And as I get into the car and I start to drive away, he's standing by his cruiser, and I look in the mirror and he's waving at me. Now, you tell me, do you think that was a state trooper or was that Krishna? I don't know. Now, the reason I love that story is because I didn't have an intention to do anything to that state trooper. I was what I was at that moment, and that nature of that space allowed him to open up and touch a place in himself that it's usually locked away in the game he's trapped in. And I could imagine that his tasting that would affect how he is with his wife, his children, his dog, what he would talk about. I could feel the way the web worked. And I started to imagine, when we say, what can we do? The more interesting question is, how can we be? Because I see the way thought and information works in the universe. Now with the information age, everybody is like a microsecond away from everybody else. And whatever message, as pure as it is, as deeply as it resonates with the truth of the heart, so can it be heard if it is in the way of things that it should be heard. And therefore, I come away from this understanding with the realization that the gift I can offer into the bringing a harmony and beauty into system is the work I do on myself to free me from the identification of my awareness with models, expectations, and such. So that I can be an environment in which you can become what you need to become. By my standing out of the way in sharing with you just presence, which is another way of looking at love from other than a behaviorist point of view, the way Ashley was talking about. We think in terms of vast numbers because we bought Ford's mind. But the game is one by one by one by one. Now in Island, as many of you who read the book know, there's a large island that one part of it is called Pala and the other part is called Redang Lobo. Redang Lobo, which is run by Colonel Deepa, he's a dictator and he's very interested in the oil and becoming part of the military-industrial Western concept of progress and happiness. Pala, the other part of the island, is a part that has been closed off to the outside world. And some 200 years back, through an advantageous meeting of two beings, Andrew MacPhail, a surgeon from Scotland, and the Raja of Pala, who is a Mahayana Buddhist. The two of them, because they were both wise, each in their own way from their own culture, merged Western and Eastern, merged true science, the kind of science that Ashley represented last night, the excitement in looking for oneself, with the Mahayana Buddhism, Tantrism, to create a culture in Pala. Into this culture comes Will Farnaby, an English journalist, who is shipwrecked and finds himself plunk in the middle of this forbidden culture. And Will Farnaby first meets this 10-year-old girl, Mary Saragini, who finds him frightened and pained because he's just met a snake and feared falling off the cliff. And she immediately uses the most sophisticated psychotherapeutic ways to decathect his locked libido in fear, and she brings him into the, she's 10 years old. She sounds like a little old lady. And she takes him through the trauma to free him of it immediately. And she sends her little brother for Dr. MacPhail, who is the great-grandson of the founder of Pala. And then he meets the cast of characters in this wonderful story. Murugan is a 16-year-old, handsome young boy. He is the present Raja. He is about to become of age to take over from his mother, who has been she's been holding the throne for him. She is the Rani, and she is the worst of the New Age Ranis. She is channeling Master Kuthumi and carrying out a world tour crusade of the spirit. She seems like a TV evangelist. And she and Murugan are running this, or supposedly running the island, but it's a constitutional monarchy, so the people are really running it. But they are very discontent with the way the people are running this island. And right early on, Will meets with Murugan and the Rani, and he meets with the ambassador from Redang, Bahu, and there is a very sweet and interesting and provocative conversation that goes on between Will, who is new to this island and trying to figure out what's going on. He's just tasted the beauty of the island. And Bahu, who is the ambassador from the other part of the island that is trying to get Pala to get into the oil business. And Bob and Michael will read a very brief section from that.
When I interviewed him, Morgan told me that he intends to reform the Palanese government, to develop oil industry, even establish an army.
As the representative of a foreign power, I have no right to offer an opinion.
But that doesn't prevent you from having opinions. Be assured, Mr. Ambassador, that I'm not here as a journalist and you're not being interviewed. This is all off the record.
Strictly off the record, then? And strictly as myself and not as an official personage? I believe that Murugan is perfectly right.
Which implies that you believe the present policies of the Palanese government to be perfectly wrong.
Perfectly wrong because perfectly right.
Right?
Perfectly right because so perfectly designed to make every man, woman, and child on this enchanting island as perfectly free and happy as it's possible to be.
But with a false happiness, you mean? A freedom that's only for what you would call the lower self.
Quite. But still, high or low, true or false, one must admit that happiness is happiness and freedom is most enjoyable. And there can be no doubt that the politics inaugurated by the original Palanese reformers and developed over the years have been admirably well adapted to achieving these two goals.
But you feel that these are undesirable goals?
Well, on the contrary, everybody desires freedom and happiness, but unfortunately, they're out of context. They've become completely irrelevant to the present situation of the world in general, and Pala in particular.
But they weren't irrelevant when the reformers first began their work?
Well, no. In those days, Pala was still completely off the map. The idea of turning it into an oasis of freedom and happiness made sense. So long as it remains out of touch with the rest of the world, an ideal society can be a viable society. Pala was completely viable, I'd say, until about 1905. Then, in less than a single generation, the world completely changed. Movies, cars, airplanes, radio, mass production, mass slaughter, mass communication, and above all else, plain mass, more and more people in bigger and bigger slums or suburbs. By 1930, any clear-sighted observer could have seen that for 3/4 of the human race, freedom and happiness were almost out of the question. Today, they're completely out of the question. And during this whole time, the outside world has been closing in on this little island of freedom and happiness, closing in steadily and inexorably, coming nearer and nearer. What was once a viable ideal is now quite impossible.
So, Pala will have to be changed. Is that your conclusion?
Oh, radically. And for two cogent reasons. First, because it simply isn't possible for Pala to go on being different from the rest of the world. And second, because it isn't right that it should be different.
Not right for people to be free and happy?
Not right. Flaunting your blessedness in the face of so much misery, that's sheer hubris. It's a deliberate affront to the rest of humanity. It's even a kind of affront to God.
To God.
Well, these free and happy people in Pala, they don't believe in God. They only believe in hypnotism and pantheism and free love.
So now you're proposing to make them miserable in the hope that this will restore their faith in God.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, that's one way of producing a conversion. Maybe it'll work. And maybe the end will justify the means.
Oh, it will.
But I suppose none of this matters. Good or bad, and regardless of what the Palanese may feel about it, this thing is going to happen. One doesn't have to be much of a prophet to foretell that Murugan is going to succeed. He's riding the wave of the future, and the wave of the future is undoubtedly the wave of crude petroleum.
Thank you, Bob and Stephen. I'll be done in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes to cover island. But I don't have to go into island as much because for this group, island is more familiar because it fits in with the values that most of us hold dear, and that's why we're here at this gathering. Things like the Mutual Adoption Club, where a child, once it has gotten to the toddling stage where it is no longer needs to be totally dependent on its functional mother, who has loved it into that point, it's free to go out into the village to other families when things get a little hot at home. Because people marry, and it doesn't mean that they marry, that they are going to be the most conscious environment every moment for the child. So when it gets too hot, the child can go to one of the other members. There's usually about 20 families in a mutual adoption club. So everybody in those things are everybody's child and everybody's parent and everybody's uncle and everybody's grandfather. So you have the warmth and the support of the extended family, which most of us are hungry for, believe me, hungry indeed. So that's one of the ways in which Aldous is showing how community, and as you get older into your teens, you then can leave that community and start to create other communities together, all voluntary communities, in which people are choosing to come together rather than being brainwashed or coerced into community. Early on, defining children in terms of their unique biochemistry, their unique predispositions, so that a child who loved visualization would be steered into geometry, and a child who didn't visualize might go the route of algebra. They were introduced to sciences through ecology. So they came in looking at how erosion was an imbalance of the moral issue of giving and receiving. In other words, they integrated all the different components of their education in the whole process and were invited and encouraged to experiment, to look, to try. This was all in the stage up to about 15 or 16. And then came a very critical part of Aldous's model, which was the ritual of initiation, in which these young people went through an ordeal of climbing a mountain, coming down a dangerous, courting with death, very risky, demanding situation, which pulled them into and out of themselves into the action. And then when they had been softened through this process, they were brought into the open spaciousness of the meditation space, and they had the moksha medicine experience, in which the medicine allowed them to extricate themselves from the conceptual structures that they had developed through their education thus far, not to deny them, but to get a balance between them and that which surrounds them. The silence out of which words arise. the formless out of which the form dances. And so there, all those years up to 16 were a preparation for them then to come into the balance that Aldous himself came into, between the formless and the form, in which one understands that compassion arises out of emptiness. And after that, through their lives, at various stages of their lives that were significant, they would have this ritual to keep rebalancing. And because the parents had also had this experience, the way in which they taught their children the sciences and the arts and the socialization processes were all done with the kind of consciousness that embraced the space around it as well as the form. And it's a way to teach somebody something without trapping them in it, because your consciousness is spacious enough to allow that thing to be developed as part of the dance of form, but staying within the formless. As part of that ritual of initiation, they were brought into the presence of Shiva. They were brought into the presence of the Nataraj, the dancing Shiva. And with their moksha-opened eyes, they got a chance to taste through that the process of the universe of creation and decay, of darkness and of light. They were able to have the experience that prepared them when Pala at the end is overrun by Redung, to be ready as the Tibetans to go out into the world, to meet the state trooper, and to convey the unconditional love to another person. Who knows how that web works? Who knows? So what I find in Island is an interestingly optimistic statement, because I find in it Aldous showing us the possibility that when the reasonableness of our minds meets the wisdom of our deepest understanding, there comes in the application or the manifestation of that social forms that are habitable by free people. And I think it is incredibly valuable for us to hold that possibility in mind, not because we expect it. Remember, halfway between hope and hopelessness. So. But what Island had prepared was each child to respect their deepest truth and to demand the integration of the deepest truth in the way they lived their life. One great little image. A family walks into a restaurant. This is not from Island. Family walks into a restaurant, and the waitress brings menus. She's taking the orders, and the child says, "I want a hot dog." "Sorry, John, a vegetarian hot dog." And the waitress said, "Do you want," and the mother says, "No, he'll have the steak and potatoes." And the waitress says to the child, "Do you want mustard or relish?" And then the waitress walks away, and there's silence at the table. And then the child says, "Wow, she thought I was real." And that's what Island did. It was allowed people to respect the truth of the dance. And what we would like to do to bring this together now is to invite Chunglang Alwang to come up, and we will dance the dance of Shiva, which is what these initiates saw as they opened their eyes to the reality of what is.
May I have this on?
Here.
Okay. I want to be very sure that you know, as we look out at you, the way Ramdas saw the Krishna in the State Trooper, you are all Shivas. This is not a performance. I will ask Ramdas to read the wonderful passage in Island that Aldous describe the image of Shiva. And I would like all of you to join us to get in touch with your own Shiva-ness and kinesthetically, spiritually, and share this beautiful image and this symbolism with us as I will attempt to illustrate with the poetry. And then we will play Bach's Chaconne for you, for all of us to dance into the midday break. Okay.
Do you want this moved? Do you have enough room? Okay. Dr. Robert has introduced these young people now and gets them to look at the Shiva image, the Nataraj. Look closely, Dr. Robert insisted. Look still more closely. Then, after a long minute of silence, dancing in all the worlds at once, he repeated. In all the worlds. First of all, in the world of matter. Look at the great round halo fringed with the symbols of fire within which the god is dancing. It stands for nature, for the world of mass and energy. Within it, Shiva Nataraj dances, the dance of endless becoming and passing away. It's his Leela, his comic play, playing for the sake of playing, like a child. But this child is the order of things. This child's toys are galaxies. His playground is infinite space, and between finger and finger, every interval is 1,000 million light years. Look at him there on the altar. The image is man-made, a little contraption of copper only 4 feet high, but Shiva Nataraj fills the universe, is the universe. Shut your eyes and see him towering into the night. Follow the boundless stretch of those arms and the wild hair infinitely flying. Nataraj at play among the stars and in the atoms, but also at play within every living thing, every sentient creature, every child and man and woman. Play for play's sake. But now the playground is conscious. The dance floor is capable of suffering. To us, this play without purpose seems a kind of insult. What would we really like is a God who never destroys what he has created. Or if there must be pain and death, let them be meted out by a God of righteousness who will punish the wicked and reward the good with everlasting happiness. But in fact, the good get hurt. The innocent suffer. Then let there be a God who sympathizes and brings comfort. But Nataraj only dances. His play is a play impartially of death and of life, of all evils as well as of all goods. In the uppermost of his right hands, he holds the drum that summons being out of non-being, rub-a-dub-dub, the creation tattoo, the cosmic reveille. But now look at the uppermost of his left hands. It brandishes the fire by which all that has been created is forthwith destroyed. He dances this way. What happiness! Dances that way. And oh, the pain, the hideous fear, the desolation. Then hop, skip, jump, hop into perfect health, skip into cancer and senility, jump out of the fullness of life into nothingness, out of nothingness again into life. For Nataraj, it's all play. And the play is an end in itself, everlastingly purposeless. He dances because he dances. And the dancing is his Mahasukha, his infinite and eternal bliss. Eternal bliss. Eternal bliss? For us, there's no bliss, only the oscillation between happiness and terror, and a sense of outrage at the thought that our pains are as integral a part of Nataraj's dance as our pleasures, our dying as our living. The seconds passed. The silence deepened. Suffering and darkness, old age, decrepitude, and death. I show you sorrow. But that wasn't the only thing the Buddha showed us. He also showed us the ending of sorrow. Shivaya Nama, the old priest cried triumphantly. Open your eyes again and look at Nataraj up there on the altar. Look closely. In his upper right hand, as you've already seen, he holds the drum that calls the world into existence. In his upper left hand, he holds the destroying fire, life and death, order and disintegration impartially. But now look at Shiva's other pair of hands. The lower right hand is raised and the palm is turned outward. What does that gesture signify? It signifies, don't be afraid. It's all right. But how can anyone in his senses fail to be afraid? How can anyone pretend that evil and suffering are all right when it's so obvious they're all wrong? Nataraj has the answer. Look now at his lower left hand. He's using it to point down at his feet. And what are his feet doing? Look closely. You'll see that the right foot is planted squarely on a horrible little subhuman creature, the demon Muyalaka, a dwarf, but immensely powerful in his malignity. Muyalaka is the embodiment of ignorance, the manifestation of greedy, possessive selfhood. Stamp on him, break his back. And that's precisely what Nataraj is doing, trampling the little monster down under his right foot. But notice that it isn't at this trampling right foot that he points his finger. It's at the left foot, the foot that as he dances, he's in the act of raising from the ground. And why does he point at it? Why? That lifted foot, that dancing defiance of the force of gravity, it's the symbol of release, of moksha, of liberation. Nataraj dances in all the worlds at once. in the worlds of physics and chemistry, in the world of ordinary, all too human experience, in the world, finally, of suchness of mind, of the clear light.